Hey everyone, how's it going? This is the Bald Metal Nerd coming at you with another vid. And in this video, I thought I would ask a simple question and give a bit of my opinion on it, maybe, even though I don't really have a really strong answer on this one. Uh, what actually prompted me to ask this question was I was commenting on one of Corey's of Just Add Vinyl on one of his recent videos, basically talking about what is obviously the name of this video is what is classic rock, right? So I'm kind of trying to figure that out, because I'm thinking about when I grew up, because I remember growing up, in the 80s and 90s and hearing the term classic rock a lot on the radio stations, right? And they would always play song or music basically from, like, say, the mid 60s up until like the late 70s, right? Or even early 80s, right? That's what I would hear on the classic rock station back, 30, 40 years ago, almost at this point. And that's kind of still, honestly, what we hear mostly on classic rock stations even now. And back then, when I was growing up, oldies was considered, like stuff from the 50s, right? Even some rock and roll from the 50s. Like you wouldn't hear like too much Elvis Presley, for example, or Little Richard, just really early rock. You would not hear played on the classic rock station. And ironically, we're now, like, if we're talking about the 1980s, we're closer in time. The 1980s were closer in time to the 50s than, kind of where we are now compared to, say, the late 80s, right? I mean, just something to think about, right? It's just funny the way the passage of time works like that. So, I was just remember thinking about this, and I'm thinking, well, what is classic rock? Is it basically music that is of a, like, for lack of a better term, rock and roll hits that are of a certain age, right? And should the oldest stuff now, like the stuff from, like, say, the 60s and early 70s, now be considered oldies? Because let's face it, we're talking music from the early 70s that is now literally 50 years old. And if we're talking about music from the early 60s, that is now 60 years old. So is there a transition from when it goes to classic to being an oldie? I don't know. Or does it just stay a classic? Um, is it only, from, like, the, say, early to mid 60s to like the early 80s, and then anything after that just isn't classic rock, even though it can be quite old? I don't know. Hard question to answer. So I'm going to show off some examples of some music that I'm going to talk about, and we're going to try to figure out if it's classic rock or not. So the first album I'm going to show off is this one. This is Aerosmith, 9 Lives, right? Now, we hear Aerosmith on classic rock stations, rotations, whatever, all the time. But we don't really generally ever hear anything from this album, 9 Lives. Why not? This was released in 1997. It is now 21 years old. It's old enough to drink. Or wait, no, it's older than that shit. 1997. How old is that? That is just shows my brain going out on me a little bit. That is 20. Oh, 24 years old. This is 24 years old, so it's been old enough to drink for a couple of years, right? And I guarantee, and obviously, back in the earlier days, stuff that was that old of Aerosmith was most certainly definitely considered classic rock, but not this. Why not? It's by a bona fide classic rock band. It's old. Why wouldn't this be considered classic rock? Maybe my own personal definition of it is classic rock, but I don't know if it fits everyone's definition of classic rock, right? So that's an interesting one to think about. Let's see. Another one to show off here is, oh, what the heck? I'll do my first twofer, right? Okay. Now, you will hear a crap load of music from this on classic rock stations and rotations and all that. And that, of course, is like, 1970s Black Sabbath. You can hear that stuff constantly, right? On classic rock and classic rock rotations or whatever, even though it was, quote, the first metal, for lack of a better term, right? But yet it still somehow falls into the classic rock banner. Whatever, right? But what about this? Here we have basically a 30-year-old album, but I don't hear too much stuff from No More Tears played on classic rock. It doesn't really happen. But it's old as hell, right? And again, back in the 90s, this was closer to current than this is now. Right? So, is it classic rock? I don't know. Here's an example of something I pretty much never hear on classic rock. Obviously, this is Metallica's Black Album, and absolutely gigantic. I mean, now I hear it on the, quote, regular rock station all the time, but as far as on the classic rock station, I don't ever really hear this. This was a massive 1991 hit, 30 fucking years old, and I never even hear this referred to as classic rock. Does this qualify as classic rock? Depends on what definition we go by. Is it just a certain time period? Because if we're only defining it as from the 60s to the early 80s, then a lot of that stuff I showed most definitely would not qualify. But I don't know. I don't know if I qualify that or not, because I'll never forget the first time I heard what I'm about to show off next on a classic rock station. And that's just how I knew I was truly an old man. I don't know. This was probably back in the 2010s or so the first time I heard this on a classic rock station. And that is, I heard Smells Like Teen Spirit on a classic rock station. So does this qualify as classic rock? I would say so. I would honestly say everything I've shown so far would classify as quote unquote classic rock, right? Very iffy, but on some stuff. But I would say everything I've shown so far probably would qualify, at least with my personal definition. Because the way I would define classic rock, this is just me, by the way. I would define it as any rock that is older than, say, 20 years. Have to give it at least 20 years. It has to be at least 20 years old, and it has to, obviously be rock and roll, and it has to have, kind of a what am I trying to say? Lasting cultural significance, right? So, is this still something that is influencing people? Is it still something that is kind of held up as relevant to, kind of the overall rock music scene? And if it meets those criteria, I think that, to me, would make it, quote, classic rock, right? That's how I personally would define it. Now, I know that's not how, obviously, a lot of people define it. In fact, I will link below in the video description some articles that I read on this specific subject that kind of contradict my definition of it a little bit. But I will leave you with one final question to see if you think this next one is classic rock or not. I'm going to show off Nine Inch Nails' first album. Now, it's industrial, but it still is, in my opinion, rock, right? And I defend putting this in the classic rock category because, if we think about Pink Floyd and other bands like that, tons of them use synthesizers and other experimental things that just weren't guitar, right? And nobody would tell me that Pink Floyd is not a classic rock band. In fact, a lot of people would say Pink Floyd is one of the very quintessential classic rock bands. So why not rock that uses, it's obviously still rock, but, incorporates some other stuff too. So anyway, that's pretty much it. Leave your comments below, please. Maybe we get a good conversation started on this. This was a little bit of just a fun one for me to ramble on a bit about. So anyway, that pretty much wraps it up. As always, live long and prosper. Keep on rocking. I'll see you guys in the next one.